Anyway, it's nice to see you all here. Good morning. My name is Steve Wheeler. I'm going to be chairing this session this morning. And we're starting a bit early, but I think people will still drift in. We've still got a few chairs. If you can find an empty chair, use it. If you can't, then tough. But probably the TLR to blame for that. But it's nice to see you all here, and so many of you. It's always a popular session. This is the now and next of learning and technology, and it's always, as I say, a popular session because everyone wants to know what the future is. And of course, none of us can tell the future because the future is imaginary. It hasn't happened yet. Unless, of course, you know different and you're a time traveler, perhaps. I don't know. The past, of course, we can look at, and we can look at trends and trajectories because the past is a memory, it's happened, and the present is now. This is what we've got. So I've got two wonderful speakers. This is like a transatlantic treaty, isn't it, today? Because both of these guys today have flown across the Atlantic in the last few hours, and I don't know how jet-lagged you are, but I'm sure you're raring to go. We'll find out. So let me introduce the two speakers to you. First, we're going to have David Kelly, who is Executive Director of the eLearning Guild, based in New York. Is that right?
Yes.
Still based in New York. But the eLearning Guild, of course, is I suppose it's international now, isn't it, really? It's certainly across the US. And David is going to come up and speak first, followed then, okay, we have Dani here, Dani Johnson, who is from RedThread research agency. Now, that's based out, you tell me, in Salt Lake City, in Utah.
Our main office is actually in the Bay Area.
Right. And obviously, she is the co-founder of that, and you've probably read her biography and seen what she's been doing with her other co-founder. So it's going to be great to hear from them both about what they think is coming next. But here's the important thing that I want you all to think about, and we're going to do this right at the end. We're going to have a discussion right at the end. And please get your questions together because it'll be you that drives that next session. I'll have a few questions up my sleeve, but I want you to drive the session and to ask the pertinent questions about how learning and technology meld together within your organization, how you actually make sense of it, and how you drive forward learning in your organization. Don's already mentioned earlier on in the plenary session about the bridge, which is the idea that we discuss how we can take what we learn today and over the next couple of days and apply them directly, pragmatically, practically to what we're doing in our organizations. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like you to welcome our first speaker, David Kelly.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us here today. It's great to see such a full house for this session. We're here to talk about technology and how it's affecting the work that we do. And when we had the opportunity to get together and talk about this session, there's a lot that we could explore. And Don approached me and said, why don't you talk about what's going on with technology and how it goes? I said, yeah, we could do a whole day workshop on that. He said, great, you got 20 minutes. How we've separated that is I'm going to talk a little bit this morning around the context of what it means to work in learning and technology, and lay a little bit more of a foundation and give some of my opinions on some of the things we need to think about differently before Dani gets on and talks about some of the research about what's going on within the marketplace in and of itself. So for my session, for my talk, my part of the discussion, whenever I do a talk, it's always about the title slide. What happened? That title slide sets up a lot. First off, before I get into my title slide, I want to point out a little URL. I'll show this again at the end. My slides, any resources that I happen to mention, anything that you could possibly want that I mention to reference later, go to that. It'll take you to a page on my blog, and it'll show you my slides and all the resources that are there. But as you'll see as I go through my slides, they're fairly basic. But all the resources I mentioned will be in there. But my title slide, I thought about, we're talking about the now and next of learning and technology. And maybe you going with the fortune teller might create that vibe. But we're talking about the tech. We should really concentrate on the tech here. So maybe I should go with a title slide that represents that tech. And I thought, well, what's the essence of why everyone's in this room? We're talking about predicting the future of learning technology, looking into the future of what technology is going to bring and what it means to our field. And once I started thinking about this nature of predictions, I wanted to be fully transparent and go with a blindfolded monkey throwing darts. Because the reality is all the predictions that we can be talking about are useless without the context of your own individual organizations. You're going to hear a lot of people talking about what's going on and how this is going to change the field and all these different things that we do. But the reality is none of that makes a difference until you put it into the context of what you do and what your organization's goals are. You have to realize that what works for one person's organization might be completely inappropriate for another. So you have to hear all the stuff that you're going to be hearing over the next 2 days. You have to put it into the context of why it matters to you. And I also do think that the language that we use is really, really important. You're going to hear a lot of people talking about a lot of great things over the next 2 days. The language that we use is really important. When I do a talk like this, I'm always fascinated to look at how the organization positioned the talk. The title I use when I'm asked to do a presentation like this is pretty standard, but I always see it two ways: the now and next of learning and technology, or the now and next of learning technology. Now you might think of that it's a meaningless difference between those two, but I think it's really important. Language is really, really important because we use this phrase, learning technologies, and I'm here at the Learning Technologies Conference and Exhibition. But the reality is, if you look at the words that we're using and what they actually mean, majority of the stuff that we're doing is not, when we have a conversation around learning technologies, we're not talking about learning technologies, for the most part. If you go down to the exhibition downstairs, there are a host of vendors offering tremendously valuable products that can do us a lot of good. But I'd argue that it's not really a learning technologies conference. Because there's a difference between learning technologies, as we've defined it as an industry, and learning and technology. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. I haven't met most of you in this room. I don't know many of you. I don't know what your backgrounds are. I don't know where you're coming from. And yet, I guarantee we've all shared a similar experience. You're out to dinner with your friends. You all look as fabulous as these people up on the screen. The drinks are flowing. The conversation's flowing. It's the best dinner you've ever had in your entire life. And then someone at the dinner party asks a question that brings the table to silence because no one knows the answer. And after about a second and a half of awkward silence, someone at the table will break the silence by saying what? I'll Google it. I will also wet my house that no one in the history of these dinner parties has ever been in that situation and said, that's a great question. I'm going to log into the LMS and get the answer. That's not a criticism of the learning management systems. Learning management systems have a very specific purpose, and it is very good at what they're doing. But that's just the reality of what we're looking at. When you think about how we exist in a digital world, it is a very different environment. How we learn and how we live and exist in a digital world is very, very different. I think of this and I think of my children and how I see them exist in the world. My son wants to figure out how to use a toy. He ignores the instruction manual and looks on YouTube for an instructional video. It's not because he's a digital native. It's not because of his age or anything like that. It's because it's no stereotypes. It's just about living in a digital world. He's not a self-directed learner. That's our jargon. He's solving problems on his own because of what he is able to do. That's what living in a digital world looks like. And I always look at, as much as I'm fascinated by all the stuff that we do within the learning technology as we define its space, which are really, if you go downstairs, you're not seeing learning technologies for the most part, you're seeing educational and training technologies. That's not better or worse, but it's a difference that we have to be aware of. Because when you think about learning technologies and the difference between how we learn through technology, it's a different lens. And it opens up our ideas to what we could be doing in a totally different way. I do think that if you want to understand how technology is going to be changing how we learn, you don't look at our landscape. If you want to understand how technology is going to change the way that we learn, you don't look at learning industry. You don't look at the education industry. You want to understand how tech is changing how we truly learn, you look at how tech is changing how we live, how we interact with each other and with information in a digital environment. That's going to shape how we change how we learn through digital means. It's going to shape the future of education. It's going to shape the future of training. As much as I am in the learning technologies business, that's what I do with the eLearning Guild. I host conferences like this throughout the United States. This is my business. And yet I will say fully transparently, the most important conference to me in terms of understanding how technology is changing learning isn't my conferences. It isn't this conference. It's the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas every single year. I look at that and I understand how technology is shaping our daily lives. Because the way that we change, the way that we live our daily lives every single day through these technological means is shaping human behavior, and expectations around how we learn through that is going to change. So we have to understand that. So when we talk about a talk like this and exploring the learning and technology landscape, it's not a conversation about technology, although we're going to talk about a lot of tech. It's not a conversation about learning, although we're going to talk about learning. And it's not a conversation about training. Ultimately, what we're talking about here, and as we start looking at the landscape and how everything around us is changing, is a conversation about disruption. Now, disruption is a big buzzword, but I mentioned earlier, I'm fascinated by language. Disruption is a word that fascinates me because disruption is a word that people look at one of two ways. Either we're looking at it from the innovation standpoint of disruption's good, we're going to be innovating, and disruption is a word that powers the other word, innovation, both of which we use a lot, but we don't really know what they mean. But we have, on the other side of it, disruption, some people look at it and say bad. Ooh, that's change. I don't like change. Disruption is going to be bad. And it's fascinating because disruption is a completely neutral word. Disruption, it just simply means a change in the status quo. Disruption is not positive or negative. Disruption is a neutral word. What makes disruption positive or negative is not the change itself, but how we react to the change. And that's really critical for me as we look at the future of learning and technology in our industry, because we're going to be going through a lot of change. And we've been through this before. Many of us come from a world of classroom training. As I look around the room and as I start to get older, I realize that that statement becomes less relevant. Because some of you have never been in a world of classroom training. But some of you are probably still there, your organizations do classroom training. But there was a time, I know for some of you in this room, this might be unfathomable, but there was a time where that's what training was. That's what training and education was. It's all it was. Because we didn't have computers readily accessible yet. And then one day, these computers came in, and we had this new disruption, e-learning. This new way of doing things, which is so used to us now, where it's so commonplace now, but there was a point where that never existed, and suddenly we introduced it, and it was really disruptive. So my first question for you is, who was e-learning disruptive to when it first emerged? Thoughts? Genuine question, but I'm also checking my time.
Hotels.
I'm sorry?
Because they didn't have venues for classroom.
Hotel, yeah, okay, good. Other thoughts? Trainers? Good. Managers? Learners? You've hit on two of the three that I identified three major buckets. The first one is the learners themselves. Now, full disclosure, this picture lies. I am in the e-learning guild. I am a firm believer in the transformational power of technology-based learning, and I think we do great work that can really transform people. All of that said, no one in the history of e-learning has ever been that happy to take a course. But the reality is e-learning was really, really disruptive. We have a paradigm of what learning looks like, that we're conditioned by 12+ years of school as to what learning looks like. It looks like a teacher in the front of the room sharing information with novice students. That's what learning looks like. And now I'm going to sit in front of a computer and I'm going to do it there. And it's so commonplace today that we forget how disruptive that was to the learners, to the students. People mention the trainers. All right, so I have my instructional design, I have my facilitator's guide, and I have my participant's guide, and I have my classroom. And now you want me to build a drag and drop? Where am I dragging it? Why am I dropping it? What's going on? I have no idea. It's a totally disruptive world when you go into e-learning as a trainer. And the one I didn't hear was the organizations themselves. Organizations, it was a really disruptive thing. Now remember, disruption is a totally neutral word. For organizations that were sending people to hotels and paying for travel and all of these different things to send people to training, wait a minute, they can do it in their workplace? They can do it right there on a computer, and I don't have to pay for the travel, and I don't have to pay for the food, and it's going to cost us huge amounts of money? Sign me up. It was a disruption, but it was viewed as a positive disruption. Look at the history, we leaned a little too far in that direction in the early days. But the reality is this was a disruption that organizations saw as a good thing because it enabled them to save a lot of money. So I share that context simply because as we look at the future of L&D, many of us lived through that disruption. But that was one thing, the emergence of the desktop computer that disrupted the world of training. And it was for those of you that lived through it, it was a really disruptive time. But that was one thing. If you look at the environment that we're in today and how digital technology is advancing and how it's going to change the way that we live and thus how we learn through these technologies, there's a lot of new things coming. Now, when I do a presentation like this, I normally kind of go through the entire landscape of different things that I see as emerging and prepare some additional context. I wanted to instead, based on the fact that this is a shared session, focus on the ones that I think have some risk attached to them, focus on the ones that I think are potentially holding us back, or if we don't change the way change the lens through which our industry looks at them, we might be leaving the potential off the table. So I'm only going to talk about a couple of the things. Danny's going to go into more detail of the entire landscape, but I wanted to kind of get on the soapbox a little bit during my time here and talk about a couple of specific things. And first off, let's start with this idea of multi-device learning. How many of you are developing content with multiple devices in mind today? Most of you, good. What's the word for the type of design that we often associated with designing so it could be used on multiple devices? Responsive design, good. I'm not checking my Twitter feed, I swear. So responsive design, we throw that word around a lot. And responsive design, for those of you who may not necessarily be familiar with it, essentially means designing in a way so that the content is appropriately displayed regardless of the device that you're looking at. We actually used to have an environment where you had the 4x3 desktop, and then in order to get on a mobile device, you shrunk it to get onto the mobile device. And that was just shy of useless. But now we have this idea of responsive design where you design it once and it takes that desktop experience and makes it appropriate regardless of the design, which is in and of itself not a bad thing. It actually sounds like a very good thing. And in terms of web design, it is a very, very good thing. But I would argue it repeats the mistake that we've made multiple times in our industry in the context of how we use these devices. Let's go back to e-learning for a second. When e-learning first emerged, we approached it with the wrong question. Again, language is important to me, and I always sometimes look at it, I look at these situations and I say, what question are we asking as we approach this? And I think we approached new technologies with the wrong question. We tend to come to them and say, this new technology emerged, whatever it is, this new technology that's out there, how do I do what I do with this new technology? Which is not a bad question on the surface, but I would argue it's the wrong one. Because it's not about how do I do what I do through this new technology. It's about how does this new technology potentially change what I do? What could I do with this new technology that I've never been able to do before? Now go back to e-learning for a minute. We missed the boat on that. At least we've made a lot of strides very well over the last 2 decades that e-learning has been commonplace. But when it first came out, what did we do? We took the classroom and we shoved it onto a computer. We didn't look at the fact that it's now, well, what does it mean that this person's got a keyboard in front of them? What does it mean with the fact that this person's got a mouse that they can move around with? What does it mean with the fact that there's a processor and there's all this capability to interact with the digital thing? No, we took the classroom experience and we shoved the PowerPoint in and we allowed people to click next so they could read it on their own. For the most part, broad stroke, I get that. Because we didn't necessarily look at it and say, what does it mean that I have this desktop? What can I do differently that I've never done before? We've made a lot of strides on that, but when we first started, we didn't do that. We're kind of doing the same thing with mobile. If you take, with all these different devices, if you start with the place of multi-device learning and saying we need to make sure that this experience we built for the desktop is appropriately accessible on any device that they're on, you're leaving so much off the table. Think about what your mobile device can do. It's got an accelerometer, it's got a camera, it's got processing power that kicks the butt of most PCs that you had 10 years ago. It's got all of these different unique affordances. It's got a GPS that has the context of where you are at any given moment. If we're treating it as a second screen, we're leaving all of that off the table. Perfect example. I'll go back to the way, if you want to understand how technology is going to change the way that we learn, look at how it's changing the way that we live. Think about how your organization is currently using mobile devices. Think about that for a second. Now think about how you've used your mobile device so far today. I would venture to guess that there's a gap between those two worlds in terms of how you use your device today personally and how your organization might be leveraging them in the context of learning and development. That gap is the opportunity of coming to it with the right question. There's huge opportunities in treating these devices differently as less screens for learning content and more tools through which people can perform better. And I encourage you to try to look at it through that lens. Another big topic, data and analytics. We hear this phrase, big data, big data. We heard about it in the keynote this morning, big data. It's going to be all these different things. I love this image. This was one of the few images that really got it right for me. Because for me, big data has never been about the size of the data. It's never even been about the fact that these computers are now available that can process this huge amounts of data and give us analytics around it. It's about the fact that we're able to make decisions around it. You know, we hear a lot about the learning analytics and how we're going to be changing the way we do this. Experience API and other specifications are emerging that enable us to track better data. But if we're not looking at it through a different lens, we're going to have the same problems we have today. We have to be looking at it and saying, if we're going to have all of this data, what decisions are we going to be able to do? You hear the phrase predictive analytics in today's keynote. You hear other phrases around analytics. It's about how we're going to make decisions based on this data, how we're going to use that knowledge and the stuff and the information that's coming out of these analytics to change the way that we approach our work. It's not about just understanding using big data so that we can better understand the effectiveness of our training programs. That's not the model, because that assumes that we're going to do everything that we do, but we're going to understand it better. That's not shaping a decision. The power of big data and analytics is not about understanding what we're doing better. It's about informing what we should be doing in the first place. Now, one of the other things, and this applies to any technology you're going to be looking at, some of you might be thinking of big data or hearing about what's going on in the learning analytics space and saying, that's not us. We're not there. I'm never going to be bringing that into my organization. We're not there. And you're not wrong for that. Again, you've got to put this in context. You may not be in a position within your environment and within your culture to change the way that you look at learning analytics in your organization, and that's fine. Doesn't mean you're not invested in the learning and the analytics conversation. There's a phrase that I find myself using a lot more that I think is a skill set that all L&D professionals need to develop, and I refer to it as conversational competence. It exists in every level of technology, but I always bring it up in the data and analytics space simply because this is not an if for your organization. It's a when. It's not a question of, well, we're not playing in that space, so I don't have to worry about it. If you're driving it within your organization, great. I think it's wonderful, and I think you should continue to do that. But if you're not, you still need to be ready for it, because at some point you're going to get a knock on the door from your IT department that says, we've upgraded our systems and we're going to be plugging into your LMS or whatever platform that you have, and we're going to be looking at the data differently. And you don't want to be in that situation to go, can I just Google what data and analytics means for a minute? You want to be ready to participate in that conversation. You want to at least be knowledgeable enough that when the conversation is presented to you about any technology, but definitely about big data and analytics, that you can participate in the conversation, that you're knowledgeable enough about what's going on within the business environment that you can participate in that. Yeah? Oh, I thought you could. Oh, 5. Okay. Other things. I thought you had a question. Workflow learning. We heard about this morning as one of the things. Workflow learning. Big thing within our industry. I didn't know what to put on this. I like the phrase workflow learning, but the reality is I could have made this slide a little differently. I could have titled this, instead of workflow learning / micro-learning / performance support / just-in-time training / whatever buzzword we want to throw at it next. The reality is we talk about all of these different things as if they're all separate and unique things. We've been talking about the ability for us to give people support in the process of work for decades. For decades. Microlearning isn't a new thing. Workflow learning isn't a new thing. What's new are the technologies that enable us to play in that space more effectively. We should always be looking at our work through the lens of what's the least disruptive way that I can get people the support that they need, when they need it, where they need it. You can call it whatever you want. I like the phrase workflow learning because it seems appropriate, but call it whatever you want. Our ability to play in the space of giving people the support during the process of work is better than it's ever been before. There are new technologies emerging. We'll talk about the learning landscape in a little bit. There are new technologies emerging all the time that are enabling us to play in that space more effectively than we ever have, but we're not going to be able to play in that space unless we look at the work that we do through a better lens. And that lens I've always looked at is what's the least disruptive way that we can give people what they need. And then we have this idea of AI. AI has been all around. With all due respect to this morning's keynote, I hate when we describe AI using this image. It's not about robots. It's not about the robot revolution. It's not about it. When I stumbled across this image, I was like, that's it. It's not about machines taking over. It's about machines and humans working together. It's about offloading the stuff that humans don't need to do that machines can do better so that we can focus more on the human element. And that's going to be a shift in just the future of work that we need to adapt into our practices. Not only are the tools and techniques that we're going to be using as L&D professionals going to incorporate this more and more in the future, but the work that the people that we support it's going to be impacted by this as well. So we need to be able to be developing competence around that. So what does it mean for us as I start to wrap up and move it on today? It means that our practices are changing. It means that instead of looking for one tool that rules them all, we have more of an ecosystem of different tools that support work, some of which we control, some of which we need to be aware of because it influences the ability of the end user to perform. It's an ecosystem of resources that support the individual in the center. It's also about learning. We hear this idea of learning personalization. Again, with all due respect to anyone who might be playing in this space, I don't believe we have learning personalization yet. You might go around downstairs and see people talking about learning personalization. We're getting there, and I think that the tools needed to build a true learning personalization infrastructure that can support that are there, but they haven't been packaged in a way that it's functional to truly personalize. Branching for someone or giving someone relevant content to me is different than a personalized experience that is giving me the support that I need based on the competence that I have. We're not there yet, but it's emerging. And then we have this idea of digital learning. Digital learning to me is a growing phrase that I think we are bastardizing within our industry. Digital learning to me goes back to where I started. It's not about training and education activities, digital learning. It's about activities that we're engaging in through learning. The idea of I don't know the answer, I'm going to Google it. That to me is digital learning. It's about how we learn. Digital learning doesn't look like learning. It looks like people solving problems in real time. If we're going to really adapt digital learning and harness it for the true potential it has within our industry, it's about focusing on the activities of the learner, not the activities of the trainer. So with that, I want to remind you of that URL that I mentioned earlier. My slides, all the resources that I might have mentioned, as well as a host of additional resources that I use to support this talk, will be available with that URL. And if you wanted to contact me, these are different ways that you can do that. And with that, I will turn it over to Dani.
Can I just mention, while we're changing over, people standing at the back, do you want seats? Because we can get people to move in, or there are seats at the front here, if you don't mind the walk of shame. But if you need seats, then I'm sure there are a few around. So move in if you can, people, and make space for them. Okay. And there are a few seats at the front here as well.
Oh, there you go.
On the side here.
It's already open. Minimize monitors.
And do get your questions ready as well, because we will have a discussion as soon as Dani's finished. Questions about both of the presentations.
Thank you so much. Okay, as I think Steve said, a really good foundation for the discussion that I'm going to have. We're going to talk about the supply side of what Steve just talked about. So at RedThread, we've been doing a very lengthy, it's actually continuous research project on the technologies that actually exist in the learning tech space right now. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about what that looks like. I want to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing there, and then I want to talk about a way to look at it because it is just really crazy out there right now. So just starting with the market, what's out there? We have currently looked at 183 learning tech vendors. And they're not falling into the regular categories like LMS or content creation tool. There are 183 tools that are currently in the market that we've looked at, and we know that that isn't all of them. We know that we've just sort of barely scratched the surface of that. The chart on the right is when they entered the market. So that you can see in about 2000 there was an influx, and then in 2011 there was another influx. That little tip at the top just means that we don't know the ones that have just entered the market yet, because this is based on year founded, and it usually takes about 2 years for a learning tech company to hit the market. So there are 183 vendors that we've looked at that we currently have information on, but the more disturbing part is that there's lots of different kinds of functionality. So when you go shopping for e-learning, or when you go shopping for learning technology, you're usually thinking in terms of LMS or LRS or whatever sort of technology you're looking for. When we started talking to these individuals and scouring their websites, what we found is that they're going to market in about 28 different ways. And we think this is all of them for now, but it could change next week depending on what pops up. So 28 different types of functionalities, 183 different vendors. It's a jungle out there. So let me talk just a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing. associated with that. And the reason that I bring these up is because it makes your job as learning and development professionals or the person in charge of technology much more complicated than it's ever been before. The first trend that we're seeing is the rise of the point solution. So you can see this is a chart of our 183 vendors. About 58% of them fall in that 1 to 10 functionality. So those 28 functionalities we just talked about, 1 to 10 functionalities belongs to about 58% of those vendors, which means that the majority of the vendors in the marketplace right now are point solutions. And we think the reason is, about 5 years ago, we were all talking about platforms and the promise of the platform, and the promise of the platform was twofold. One, you could have all of your learning in one place. There was a front door to the learning in your organization, but that isn't as important as it was before because we live in an app-based world, and so people are used to going to different places for learning. And so organizations are starting to realize that and put the learning where it makes the most sense rather than having a front door to learning. The second promise of the platform is data, and David talked a little bit about that. If you had all of your data on one platform, it was easier to draw insights and all that great stuff. The things that have happened in the last 2 years also changed that. APIs are getting better, integrations are getting easier, and frankly, I haven't talked to one vendor who can't tell me how to get their data in and out of their platform. And so those two promises are no longer true, so we're seeing sort of a rise of point solutions, really interesting point solutions, that I think actually might have legs. Now, obviously, there's a contraction in the market, and there will continue to be a contraction in the market as people continue to grow, or continue to buy some of these smaller companies. But I really think for the first time in the history of learning technology that they actually have a chance of standing on their own. So that's the first trend. And because there are so many point solutions, there's a lot of confusion out there about who does what and all of that great stuff. The second thing that we're seeing is there are lots of choices for the same functionality. So those 28 functionalities, unfortunately, are not just single point solutions. Organizations, vendors are combining different types of these functionalities into a solution and then offering them to the market. And that's great, except that some functionalities exist in several of your tools, and so understanding all of the functionalities that your tools have is probably more important than it's ever been. So if you look at the right side of the graph, the top three are analytics, assessment, and content creation. Just a note on content creation, it used to be that you bought a tool specifically to create content for your people. 85, about 40% of the vendors that I've talked to have content creation on board. So it's no longer a standalone solution, it's actually built into whatever platform you're going to be using to deliver it. That's commonplace. It's almost becoming table stakes. So I actually think the content creation thing will go down. The other one that assessment does not surprise me. You need some sort of assessment to drive any of the data that David talked about. So assessment doesn't surprise me. And then the other side is analytics. We're not just talking about reports that you can print out anymore. We're not just talking about canned reports. We're talking about true analytics that can feed information back into the systems to make them better. So this is what the choices look like as far as functionality goes. At the other end, you'll see a couple of things like expertise directories, project marketplaces, and MOOCs and cohorts. MOOCs and cohorts doesn't surprise me that it's that low. Expertise directories and project marketplaces are coming into the market. They're new offerings that these organizations, these vendors are offering because they saw a hole in the marketplace. So that's the second one, lots of choices for functionality. The third thing that we're seeing is integrations with real life. So David made a couple of really good points of we need to look at learning as if we're living in our real life. We're seeing lots of integrations. So a lot of technology companies that I'm talking to can speak to integrations here. A good example of this is EdCast just barely integrated with Teams, and they're making a big deal about that. Probably about 30% of the vendors that I talk to say that they integrate with Slack, which is a productivity tool. We know that Salesforce does the same thing. There are lots of integrations with Salesforce. We know Amazon and Facebook will start playing in this space because they've told us they're going to start playing in the learning space, so we expect to see tighter integrations there as well. And so it's not just about learning technology in a single platform, in a single ivory tower that sits on the side of your company anymore. It's about how these things integrate with the rest of the organization. And learning tech vendors are on the cutting edge of this. They're ahead of us. And then the fourth trend that we're seeing is we're actually seeing a move past learning. And I know this is a group of L&D leaders, but we're seeing a move past learning and to enablement. And the reason that I'm calling it an enablement is because I don't know what else to call it. But it's basically, David ended his talk talking about the idea of learning in the workflow. This actually goes beyond that. It's not micro-learning. It's actually defaulting to the work first and then adding tools to help you do whatever you're doing better. So think of the map function on your watch, for example. It just taps you, and eventually you don't need the directions anymore. We've identified about 15 vendors that sort of play in this enablement space. So the reason that we know that enablement is happening is, first, vendors are beginning to go after businesses, not just L&D. So it used to be that L&D was the front door to everything. Now they're actually going to the end of the line and going straight to the business and saying, we've got this solution, we think it can improve your performance, let's work together. So they're deliberately going after that market in ways we haven't seen before. The second thing is that learning solutions are incorporating performance and career functionalities, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because it's really hard to train somebody unless you know where they are, which is performance, and where they want to go, which is career. So a good example of this is Bridge. Bridge by Instructure. They started out as a simple LMS. They built a performance module, and then they built a career module. And this isn't like the modules of some of the bigger TMS systems. These modules that actually work together incredibly well. Whatever happens in performance kicks over to learning. Whatever happens in performance kicks over to career. It's all one system that works really well so that the conversation is one conversation instead of three. The third one is vendors are talking about how they fit in the larger ecosystem, and I mentioned this just a minute ago. It's a story now. They're not trying to be a standalone solution. They're able to articulate where they fit and how they interact and play with everybody else, which is part of a larger enablement play versus a standalone solution. And then finally, that category of enablement that I just mentioned. Just a couple of examples of those. There's one called Cultivate.ai. Has anybody heard of them? They're a small startup. I think they just went through Series A. But what they do is they build themselves as an engagement platform. And they sit on top of your email engine, and they look at 6 months of latent data. I know it's scary because we're in Europe and GDPR and all of that. But that's what they do. They look at 6 months of latent data, and then they can give the manager an idea of whether their people are trending up or trending down as far as engagement goes. So that's interesting because that gives me information as a manager, what's going on with my team. But what's even more interesting is it sits on the email server and then gives me hints about how I should address those people when I'm writing emails to them. So Joe has had a couple of really hard weeks. This email looks like it's going to be really hard on him. You might want to change the phrasing that you're using here, or talk to him in person, or whatever that is, and so that his engagement doesn't suffer. So instead of taking somebody out of the work, we're actually bringing the learning into the work, not through micro-learning or something like that cognitively takes them out of the space. It's directly into the flow. Another example is this little company called Trybe.ai, Trybe.ai. Tiny company. CEO's name is Naomi Davidson. She's a character, but what they do is it's an app that helps people meet their goals. And she showed me a couple of things on it. One of them is a listening tool. So if I go into a meeting and one of my goals is to ask more questions, I can turn it on, conduct my meeting, and at the end of that meeting, I'll get direct feedback on how many questions I asked, how the questions were. Using sentiment analysis and natural language processing, we have the ability to gather data on how we're doing in regular life versus learning something and then taking an assessment on it. We have that constant feedback loop, which is kind of what encapsulates this idea of enablement. So I moved past learning to enablement. We know that that's happening slowly, but a lot faster than I thought it would. Some of these technologies that David mentioned are here, and the tech vendors are in front of them, and they're providing them. So really quickly, I want to talk about a framework for understanding the learning space. So there are obviously some challenges with it, and if we're talking about 28 different functionalities versus 6 or 7 categories of learning technology that we need to pay attention to, it changes the way that we need to think about it just a little bit. This, some of you might have seen before. This is by Josh Bersin, 2016. These are 7 categories that we think of when we think of learning technologies. And until about 2016, I think it was okay. But we need to move past a focus on technology, because what happens when we look at this is 2 things. The first thing is we as L&D people look at this and say, okay, I need a micro-learning platform and an LMS, and I need to figure out how to make those work together. So we're not focusing on what we actually need to do. We're focusing on the technology that's available and how we can use it, much like David pointed out. The other thing that happens is if you think about all of those functionalities that we talked about, 28 of them, they're arranged in so many different configurations that vendors are having a really hard time deciding where they fit in this framework. I talked to one yesterday morning and he said, I don't know whether to describe myself as an LMS or a content library or a learning experience platform because we have all of those kinds of functionalities in us. So how do we describe ourselves as this? And so as much as I respect Josh, I don't know that looking at technologies as technologies is the right way to approach it. I think instead of a focus on technology, what we need to do is focus on how we enable employees. So when we were doing this look at this space, what we learned is that there were basically two buckets. There was an experience bucket, those technologies that help the learner experience or the employee experience, and then there were some admin things that we as L&D need to do just to keep the trains on the tracks. And under experience, these technologies fell in 6 major buckets. And as we've been exploring this space a little bit more, the way that we measure, the way that we skill ourselves as L&D professionals, pretty much everything that we do as L&D can fall in these 6 buckets. And when we start thinking about these 6 buckets and the experience of the learner, we're no longer talking about creating courses or making sure that our numbers for ROI are good. We're actually talking about creating an environment. We're paying attention to the conditions that exist in our organization that enable these things. So really quickly, plan. It used to not be our job. When we had complete control over what people learned in an organization, planning wasn't really our job because it just happened automatically. Now learners have access to all kinds of things. They have different career plans than we want them to have. They talk to people that we don't know. It's a mess. And so we as L&D are responsible for helping individuals understand what their plan is for learning in the organization. That's our job now. The second one is discover. This conversation about curation has been going on for years and years and years. It is our job to help people find the content they need in order to develop. Not just the content, but the experiences that they need and the people that they need as well. We need to help them discover what they need. Third one is consume. This is the one that we're probably most familiar with and most comfortable with. We help people consume the content and we distribute to people that need to know certain things. Fourth one is an experiment, and we do not do this one very well at all. We should be helping our individuals fail. We should be helping individuals in our organizations learn from their mistakes and experiment with new knowledge and skills. We don't do that one very well. Fifth one is connect. How do we connect people to other people in the organization that can help them learn? And then the sixth one is perform. How do we help them perform better on the job? And that goes to sort of the enablement thing that we just talked about. So as an L&D department, if we're doing all these things, if we're focusing on how we enable these things in the organization, we're paying attention to the entire learner experience or employee experience. And then the additional 2 for admin are manage and create, which are increasingly showing up together in the tech space, which is why they're together, and analyze. So these are the 8 things that we as L&D should be paying attention to. And when we take those 28 capabilities or those 28 functionalities and align them, this is what it looks like. So first, quit thinking about tech. Secondly, pay attention to the entire experience. And then third, layer in the tech types that are important for your organization. And once you have the tech types labeled or figured out, then you need to take some time and figure out which vendors you're going to pay attention to. And this is a space where we realized really quickly that a one-page infographic was not going to do. And so we created an online tool. So each one of these bubbles here represents an organization that we've talked to. The information on the side over here, company ratings, some analyst comments, and some information about the company itself, gives people a better idea of where they need to go and which areas that they play in. And so the plan is to choose the constellation of technologies that gives you everything that you need in order to create those 6 conditions that we talked about. So this is free on our website right now, and there's actually a report that goes along with it. You sign up for a membership. The membership is free as of now. And then the tool is going to be updated on February 20th. So right now the tool has 118 vendors in it. On the 20th, it'll bump up to that 183. And if you want us to remind you, shoot us a note, and we will make sure that you get an email and a link to that. So once you choose the right vendors, one more thing that I wanted to talk about quickly, this idea of using tech vendors as thought leaders. So for the first time in the history of learning technology, as far as I understand it in my experience, tech vendors are ahead. They're thinking ahead of what organization leaders are right now. In the past, organization leaders would determine what they needed, and then the tech vendors would catch up with them. Now, the tech vendors are ahead, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, these new technologies have enabled all kinds of things that we haven't done before. But the second thing that I'm seeing is founders who were in corporate America and basically said, none of these tools work the way that I need them to. I'm a manager, and none of these tools work. I'm going to go out and find funding and do it myself. So we've seen several vendors that started out in a completely different field and basically said, I can solve this problem. I'm going to do it with technology, and here it is. So that's where I kind of want to end. Use your tech vendors as thought partners. Leverage them. And when you're looking for good tech vendors, ask the questions about partnership, because a lot of times they'll be thinking things that your organization hasn't considered yet. Thanks.
Okay, you've heard from both of our speakers, and I'd like to thank them personally for their drive, their passion. I think you got that coming across, didn't you? Their knowledge and their insight into L&D from their particular perspectives. I think it was very comprehensive, and I'd like to thank you both. And you can tell it's a good session when every slide kind of evokes a forest of cameras going up in the air, you know? And it's you taking notes, because you have learnt in the digital world to take notes that way now. And that really kind of bears out what you've both been saying about how digital transforms the way we think and the way we expect, I think. Our expectations are shaped, aren't they, and changed by that. So we have a microphone, I think, that, where's the person with the microphone that's roving around? Do we have one? You got one there? And I think we have another mic here if we need it. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to put your hands up if you've got a question specifically you want to ask either or both of our speakers, but let me just get the ball rolling, shall I? Now, this session is really about, I suppose, looking towards the future, isn't it? I mean, it's about what can we anticipate next. Can I get a kind of an idea from you about what we need to look out for in the next maybe 1 or 2 years? Dave, first.
1 to 2 years in our industry is not going to change much.
Should we go farther? Should we go to 5 years?
I mean, I think you have to put it in context.
Yep.
You know, we tend to overshoot how quickly things are going to change.
Yeah.
I do think I think what Dani said during her session is spot on. That there is the changes that are coming are being enabled by the vendor community right now. There are a lot of things that are being built that are going to enable us to support workforces in new ways, and a lot of them are currently available, but they're also kind of advancing very quickly. So I think the ability for us to get closer to tailoring, I don't like to use the buzzword of personalized because I don't think we're there yet, but the idea of being able to better tailor content to individual needs and individual contexts is huge. I mean, for me, the big thing that we're getting towards at a larger concept is just closer to the context of and I mean that in every sense of the word, the context of what person needs to do, what they're trying to accomplish, where they are, the ability to match our efforts towards the context and how they're being used is increasing rapidly.
So tools that allow us to contextualize what we're learning into the workplace itself, into the act of doing the work itself. And I suppose, you know, driving the business strategy through that as well, perhaps. Okay, there's a connection there. Dani, what are we looking out for maybe in the next few years?
Yeah, I think I disagree just slightly with David on this one. I think it's going to happen a lot faster than we're ready for. Especially as L&D, I think it's going to fundamentally change how we do our jobs across the board. We've already seen quite a bit of change in the last 5 years, but these new technologies and the way that we need to think about the space now is incredible. If you think about, there's some Singularity University data that basically says that...
That's Ray Kurzweil, yeah?
Yeah,
Yep.
the half-life of workplace skills between 2.5 to 5 years, so every 10 years, at the very best case, you have to reskill your workforce. If that's true, L&D cannot keep up with that. And so instead of focusing on content and making sure that everything goes through us to make sure that everybody's on the same board and learning the same way and all that stuff, I think we're fundamentally going to have to shift to sort of like a zone defense. If you play basketball, like we're going to have to start thinking about those conditions. How do we enable those things to happen in the organization? How do we motivate those things to happen in the organization rather than focusing on a course as the building block of learning?
Okay, I'm looking for hands. No one's putting up a hand. I think we have one at the front here and one over there.
While we're getting the mic, I just want to add one thing to what Dani said. I very often will say that, like I said at the beginning of my talk, you have to put this into the context of what matters to you. and how it applies to your organization. I do think, to extend what Dani said, that you also have to be looking outside of your organization.
Yes.
Because you might be in the context in an organization where maybe it's not going to change in 1 to 2 years. Maybe it's not going to change in 5 to 10 years. Maybe it's not going to change in 20 years because your organization is just not that mature in the way it leverages technology.
Yeah.
But you have to also realize that the world is changing around you.
Yeah.
And none of us are likely in an environment where we're going to have one job for our entire lives now. Our need to go from one job to the next. So while your environment may not necessarily be changing as a result of these technological changes that are going on around you, your unique environment, what you may not necessarily be aware of is your employability beyond your current context might be becoming limited if you're not following this space. So it goes back to that thing I said earlier about conversational competence. You need to be aware of what's going on within the industry just so you can make sure you're staying ahead, even if it's not necessarily something you need in the context of your current role.
So there's a spectrum of responses from organizations. Some are farther behind than others. We have a question here in the front row.
Yeah, Daisy Mundy. Really interesting presentation, thank you very much. The thing that really comes across is the range of possibilities and the speed at which everything is changing. So if you're looking to put something together and you want some evidence behind that to say that this is going to work for you, where do we go for that evidence when everything is changing so fast? Who is doing that research?
So I think that's another, and I'll give you, I think that's another thing that's changing really rapidly. The organizations that tend to be doing this the best are the ones that are experimenting like crazy. So when you have an ecosystem rather than a platform, it's easier to plug and unplug things.
Can you
and
name
try
any?
things
Can you
out.
name any of those organizations?
No.
No? Is that because you can't or because you won't?
Yeah,
Right.
under non-disclosure, I
Okay.
cannot.
Right.
So it's easier to change things out. The other thing that is changing is data. We're not looking at just the LMS for data anymore. We're plugging in all sorts of data pools and taking a look at correlations and regressions in ways that we never have before, which also give us the data that we need. But what works in one organization doesn't work in another. So you've got to be comfortable with experimentation and collecting that data and being able to pull the plug on something if it doesn't work.
What I would add is I link that to a question I'm commonly asked is, how do I know it's worth investing in this technology? How do I know that it's there? And I tend to bring that down to a simple question and response is, what problem is this going to solve that you can't solve today? What is this technology going to enable you to do more efficiently than you do today? Yeah. Because if you can't answer those basic questions, why would you spend the money? So a lot of it comes down to that before you even started spending your money.
I think the problem we've got is that a lot of people see the new shiny technology out there. They think we've got to get this before everyone else does. And then they don't actually realize that once you've got it, you've got to decide what to do with it and what the problem is you're trying to solve. So it's a good point. A question from the front here.
Oh yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. Dani, your slide about integrations with real life, how important is that as a factor as like a successful learning tech vendor? Because I look at that and I think that has to be like the most important consideration, because when you're trying to convince like a company, employees to kind of get on board with your learning technology, it's always something so siloed and out of their work. Whereas when you sort of link up something to Slack, it doesn't feel like it's disconnected.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. Like, why teach somebody a new technology if the one that you've got is working? We have organizations that are using WhatsApp and all kinds of technologies to learn. And so hooking into those and understanding, I think David mentioned this in his part. Learning technology and technology that uses for learning are two different things. And so we should pay attention and take stock of all of the technology that we use for learning and then augment with learning technology as it makes sense. I think you're right.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add is I think you have to. The other thing I would add is I think you also have to, again, put it into the context of the organization you're in. I mean, the reality is on one side of it, we're saying we want to put these technologies in place and these new methods and to support people just the way that we live our lives. While in the other breath, we're dealing with stakeholders who are like, we need training. And so you have to balance that, because you ultimately, those are your stakeholders, and you have to make sure that they're happy. So you have to balance the pushing towards what we could be doing and how we can be more effective with the keeping your stakeholders happy. That's just the reality of working in an L&D department.
We have two more questions, one here and then one over here. There's no one in the back benches actually wanting to speak out at the moment, but maybe you will in a moment. But carry on.
Hi. We have an LMS and we have lots of courses and everything. And what we find, we also teach in a classroom. And what we find is that people just don't do the stuff. They get distracted. They start. We have the analytics. We can see that they start with a video and this and that, and then when you are on your own, you get distracted. When they're in the classroom, as a teacher, you walk around, you see who's looking at their, WhatsApp or whatever, who's communicating, who's asking the questions, you see who's lost, you go and offer help in one way or another. We teach software, so we go and see how they do the exercises and all that. We can do this remotely to an extent, but it is so easy to get sidetracked, to get distracted, to go into something else. So how do we solve that problem?
I'm not sure it's a problem. Let me make sure I want to say this before I say it. Completion doesn't mean success. If I jump into a course for 4 or 5 minutes to get what I need to get out of it and then jump back out, it's still a success. And so I think we need, as L&D professionals, need to change the way that we think about learning in general. We're just providing the tools that they need and the environment they need and the people that they need in order to learn at the speed that they need to learn at in order to do their job better. It's like single loop learning versus double loop learning. We've been stuck in single loop forever. But what we need to do is move to a double loop learning where we're continuously pushing the boundaries and allowing them to push the boundaries so that we can move the organization forward at the same time we're adjusting the learning schedule.
The theory behind that, by the way, is Michael Agiris.
Yeah.
So look it up if you need to know about double loop learning. It's a very interesting concept.
The other thing I would add to that is what you're describing is really, really hard for humans to do. The systems are going to be able to do that for us a lot more effectively than we never could. A lot of the systems that Dani was talking about, they analyze people's behavior. We heard earlier this morning, predictive analytics. That is all about recognizing the behavior of what people are doing to recognize when they're not engaged and to put something in place to get them before you lose them. There's a lot of work in higher education that's doing that today. We're going to be able to leverage that. And so the ability for these systems to take off the monitoring that we're doing today and kind of red flag people just based on their digital activity on where you might be able to touch them to keep them engaged in something that you might need to be able to do, that's going to be happening in an automated way better than we could ever do as humans.
The other thing that we're seeing is predictive analytics and adaptive learning and all of that stuff gives us all kinds of data we didn't have before. How far down the page did they go? What did they click on? All of this information, what kinds of things did they access, video, et cetera. So we learn what the individual wants, but we also learn from an organizational standpoint what's working. These people did these things and learned in this way, and their performance is this. I think if we stop focusing on the end of the course as the end and start focusing on the performance, then we don't care how they learn it, as long as they learn it and improve performance.
Fascinating approach to that, isn't it? And I think it's real. It's pragmatic. It's grounded in reality. A question at the front here, and then we've got one at the back over there in the middle. Go on.
David, this is a slightly unfair question because I'm going to ask you to predict the future a bit. I work for Health Education in England, so we're responsible for training education in the NHS. And we've had like 12 million launches of e-learning, do lots of e-learning. But for years I've had vendors trying to sell me personalized learning, which none of it is personalized learning. How do we get to true personalized learning at scale?
It's got to be developed. It depends on who you're defining as we. The vendor community is working towards that. I would argue that the nuts and bolts needed to deliver upon personalized learning, your AI and all these different things that are there, the pieces are there, and the vendor community is working on packaging it away that can really deliver upon it. But I don't think, you're better to respond on this than I am, I don't think that there's any vendor who can really say that they deliver upon it to that scale.
It also depends on what you mean by learning, right? Yeah. So the enablement tools that I explained, Cultivate and AI, those are the most personalized learning you can possibly get because it's feeding that information back in to make it very personal to me. So if that's what you're talking about, then yeah, it exists, and I think it'll continue to exist. We just need to change our idea about what personalized means.
That's a really good point, isn't it? What is personalization? I'm sure everyone in the room would have a different definition on this because it's personal.
So, and to put it into the context of what you're describing, this is the when I say the nuts and bolts are there, this is kind of the metaphor that I always use. Just using technology that's there today. So I have an Apple Watch I'm wearing. It's got a Bluetooth, it's got the ability to connect through my phone, which is consistently connected to the internet. So, and the second that I close my Apple Watch and I put my code in, it's authenticated that it's me. It knows that it's David Kelly. And not only can it take information from my phone, but it can broadcast. So I walk up to a piece of equipment. And as I walk up, the piece of equipment picks up the Bluetooth signal that David Kelly, and we know it's David Kelly, is walking up to you right now. It then goes through the Internet of Things, connects to your competency management system to recognize what level of competency I have within that piece of equipment. And now that piece of equipment is going to give me the appropriate level of support that I need to use that based on what my competency level is. That doesn't exist today, but the infrastructure of all those individual pieces does. That help? Okay.
Yeah. We have another question from around the middle at the back there. You've got a microphone.
Is this working? It is working. Hi, Jamie Thompson from Babcock. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. And actually, my question just changed listening to what you just said there. So I was going to ask, I think you mentioned earlier, how does new technology change the things that I do from a learning perspective? But I think that's just morphed into, when you talk about mobile devices and wearable technology and things like that, where is the line then between personal space and professional data? If that's a good question. I mean, if that makes sense as a question, but I think it's just, do I as an individual want to be monitored to the stage where I will put on my corporate watch and have them figure out what I'm doing every day? Equally, am I comfortable with them monitoring my email and also how I perform in meetings? I think that's the question.
So that's a question that relates not just to privacy, but also to identity, I think, doesn't it, really? So
yes,
it's quite a sticky question, that. I'm glad you're going to answer it.
Well, for me, it's a very simple question. Well, first off, I could give you the very American response of, well, it depends. But the reality is, for me, the answer to that is culture. That's not. You can't say that there's a right or wrong place to play. There is no black line in the sand drawn. That is a definitive. You need to figure out where you are as a culture, where you want to stick the pin, and that really does. Every person in here would probably stick that pin somewhere else.
And I think that's the point. Once we get down to the personal level, that pin is personal for everybody. If I don't want my organization to track me through my watch, I have the right to turn it off, but I may be giving up certain things if I do that.
Hope that answers your question. It's an interesting one. Are there any more questions? I think we've got time for one more before we go into the bridge. So we've got right over here. So try and get the mic across. No mic drops, please. Can we get the mic over? Here we are.
There we go.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's great. One question. Last year it was all about VR and AR, and this year we haven't had a word on this. What's your point on this subject?
Yeah.
It's getting cheaper and it's getting easier, and there are definitely applications for it. I think we over-apply it in a lot of places, but in places where it's dangerous, or I'm even seeing some applications where we're actually putting ourselves in the place of a diversity candidate to experience life how they would experience it, to give us empathy. So I think there are definitely applications, just don't over-apply it. It's coming.
What I would add to that, and I'm going to use a metaphor that's going to sound like I'm pitching something, but I don't mean to. We have a conference that we do in the States called Realities 360. It is a conference fully based on AR and VR. And this is the third year we're going to be doing it. And the reason I bring it up in the context of your question is there is a fundamental shift in the way that we're positioning the conference this year. First 2 years, it was about kicking the tires. It was about engaging people's curiosity. It was about, if you want to understand what the possibilities of these things are, you need to put a headset on. And it's like riding a bike. If you want to understand what it is, you got to get on one and start pedaling. And that's kind of the way the conference is positioned. This year, us following the market, we're changing it. It's now the Realities 360 Conference and Expo. And it is about practicality. And part of the reason that we did that is we recognized within the vendor community that it's not about the future anymore. I mean, the possibilities are still far out in terms of some of the stuff. It's rapidly advancing, but there are viable solutions that are solving problems today. I would add that I do think that, people are always looking go back to that thing I said earlier, people are always looking for the silver bullet. I don't think AR or VR are a silver bullet. I think VR has a long-term, it's got a very narrow but powerful use case. If the situation is life or death, the ability to practice when no one's going to die is kind of valuable. But I think AR has a much broader application. But we need to get past AR defined as the mobile phone and get AR defined in the headset, because when you're using it through a mobile phone, your hands are not free. So it's only when we have the headset that it's going to be transformative to workplace.
I'm going to ask another question myself, and this one might be a controversial one. So if you're a vendor in the room, this is also for you to maybe respond to. Now, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was at Olympia at the Learning Technology event, after you were there, Dave, as well, and I took a tour downstairs after listening to all of the discussions in the room in the conference. I went down to the vendors and I had a look around the exhibition. And people were approaching me, trying to sell me things like learning styles and neuro-linguistic programming and various other things that were kind of hopelessly outmoded or discredited in some way. And I wrote a blog post, which became very controversial, called Upstairs, Downstairs, talking about the gap, the distance between the vendors and the L&D practitioners, those who were actually at the workplace. Do you think that's changed? 7 years, do you think the vendors are now in touch with what we actually do in the workplace, or do you think they're still in a different place?
I would divide vendors into two groups.
Yep.
Those that are still trying those that are addressing learning as it existed 4 or 5 years ago, and those that are ahead of the game.
Right.
We're talking to more that are ahead of the game, mostly because those are the ones I'm interested in.
Yeah.
But I think you'll see both downstairs. I've taken a look at what's going on down there, and I would say there's probably half and half.
I don't think you can paint a broad stroke to say yes or no to vendors in general. I will say that vendors exist to meet supply and demand. If I think that there's you're going to go downstairs and you're going to see somebody pitching learning styles. And if you're in the room, I apologize for what I'm about to say. That's crap. But they wouldn't be able to sell it. They wouldn't be able to afford the booth down there if people weren't buying it. So if we want to debunk the myths and have these things not be part of our practice anymore, we need to stop buying it. That's just the nature of it. All the vendors that are downstairs, like all the organizations we work for, they're in the business of making money. And if we don't want these things as part of our practice, then we need to stop buying it.
So I think the answer is go engage with the vendors and talk to them about what your needs are. Talk to them and if necessary, educate them as to what the requirements are currently for learning as it stands today. Well, I think we're going to do one more thing now. I'd like us to thank Dave and Dani first for their presentation. Thank you very much.